Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Roos. I'm Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center here at the European University Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this MPC webinar. The topic of today's webinar is the prosperity paradox, fewer and more vulnerable farm workers, which is the title of a new book by Professor Philip Martin, and we're delighted to have Philip with us today to talk about his book. Many of you will be familiar with Philip's work on international migration, in particular international labor migration around the world. Today he will talk about his new book that deals with agriculture in the US, including the role of migrant workers in it. And we're also very fortunate to have two excellent discussants, both from the International Migration branch of the International Labour Organization. Christiane Kupsch is Senior Specialist in Migration Policy, and Fabiola Mieres is Technical Officer in Labour Migration at the Migrant Unit of the ILO. So thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who have listened to MPC webinars before, you will know how this works. We have Phil will talk for about half an hour, followed by Christiane and Fabiola, who will speak for about 10 minutes each. And then we will have a Q&A with the audience. And the way to ask questions is to post written questions in the chat screen on YouTube. And it will be my job as chair to then allocate the questions to the speakers and to the two discussants after the presentations are done. So without further ado, let's go ahead. Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and thank Martin and the Migration Policy Center, as well as Christiane and Fabiola for commenting on this book. There's going to be several themes that run through the book. And so let me just go up front. Say what a few of these themes are. The first is that agriculture around the world remains a major employer. Roughly 1 out of every 4 people in the world is employed in agriculture. And agriculture's a very special sector in many ways, including how the structure of farms or how the productive sector is organized. It's roughly an 80-20 sector, which means that most farms are small. They produce only for the farm family. And there's a handful of large farms. In some commodities, it's actually only 5 or 10, but roughly the 20% largest farms produce about 80% of all farm output. And when we look at agriculture, most people who are employed in agriculture are farmers and their families, and they're not paid a wage. Instead, their income is the difference between what they earn for the commodities they sell and the cost of producing them. But about 40% of the people employed in agriculture are hired. And those roughly 350 million hired workers are concentrated on those largest 20% of farms. So farm workers, hired workers, are not distributed uniformly in agriculture. They're concentrated on farms. So we have farms that will have 10 or 20,000 hired workers, even though most of the world's farms have no hired workers. So agriculture is a big employer. The second main point is that the policies, every government has policies toward agriculture. And roughly speaking, rich countries subsidize agriculture, poor countries tax agriculture. So rich countries have less than 5% of their employment in agriculture, and farm families are richer than non-farm families. They're richer primarily because they own land, which is valuable, but also because in many cases they have higher incomes, in part because their incomes are topped up by government subsidies. So in rich countries, we often have multi-generational farmers. I'm the 4th, 5th, or 6th generation to farm this particular piece of land. In poor countries, where over half of the employment is in agriculture, farm families tend to be poorer than non-farm families, which is why a lot of youth in farm families in poor countries say, I want to go to the bright lights of the cities. There's more opportunities in the cities. That's why we get rural-urban migration. And of course, one of the favorite questions that we asked our students is to prove how is it that you can tax those poor farmers when there are no checking accounts and there is no mail system? And of course, the answer is governments in developing countries often have a monopoly on who buys the cocoa or who buys the cotton, and the buyer pays a low price, turns around and sells it for a high price, and you're effectively taxing farmers without really calling it a tax. There's been a lot of policy discussion about what you do with an agricultural system which is sending workers to urban areas as countries get richer. So W. Arthur Lewis, a Jamaican economist, won the Nobel Prize in 1979 in economics for saying basically neglect agriculture, that there's a lot of excess labor in agriculture. What you should do is encourage people to move rural urban, and they will be low wage workers in factories. That's the future. You get low wages in your modern sector and you still have the same ag output. Theodore Schultz, who also won in 1979, had exactly the opposite recommendation. He said, you really have to invest in education to increase the productivity of people in rural areas, whether they stay in agriculture or move to non-farm sectors. But now let's get from background to the three main points of the book that were the prosperity paradox. The paradox is that even as agricultural employment gets less important, farm workers get more vulnerable. And the question is why? Well, and the answer is two-part. One is farm workers tend to be local workers who cannot find non-farm jobs. They may lack skills, they may lack language, there may be discrimination. There's a lot of reasons, but it's local workers without other job options. And they're joined, especially in rich countries, by migrant workers who often have restricted rights. They could be unauthorized, they could be guest workers. And there are been a lot of efforts to try to help farm workers especially in both poorer and richer countries. But unions tend to be weak because the best workers, the workers who might be natural union leaders, they tend to get out of agriculture. They can find non-farm jobs first. There are labor law enforcement agencies, but they rely on complaints. And if you're a vulnerable worker, you don't complain. There are fair trade efforts, lots of NGOs with standards and protocols and audits, but their footprint is relatively limited. The question becomes, how do you really induce compliance in a sector that is very hard for traditional institutions, whether it's unions or enforcement agencies, to get compliance? Probably the most promising thing is to adapt from food safety. The big revolution in fresh produce over the last 2 decades has been trying to make food that's typically not cooked before it's eaten safer. It's not perfectly safe, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And how does that work? Well, what you're doing is you're regularly measuring the water and the residues and everything, and you're building a huge database. And there are a whole lot of private companies as well as buyers who have computer programs to analyze that data so they can detect any anomalies. And then there are traceback systems to quickly find out where the problem may have started. The analogy to farm labor would be to have electronic timekeeping by employers and also possibly workers on smartphones, submit that data so that it's more easy to detect any kind of violations. I think the main takeaway is that farm labor problems don't fade away as the share of employment in agriculture goes down. You actually need more effort to protect workers as the sector shrinks. And maybe the best thing is to borrow from food safety systems. So now we can go a little faster, and you all have seen diagrams that look something like this. But the basic idea is if you put the share of employment in agriculture on the y-axis and the per capita income on the x-axis, you get a negative line. So the rich, if you know nothing about a country, you fly into the airport. If you say what share of the people are employed in agriculture, if it's less than 5%, you're in a rich country. If it's over 50%, you're in a poor country, and there's no exceptions to that rule. So the basic idea is the share of employment in agriculture goes down as the incomes go up. And this has been well known for a long time. And there were these two opposite approaches to thinking about how to deal with a shrinking share of employment in agriculture. One approach said basically neglect agriculture, because there's a lot of workers in agriculture who have zero or very low productivity. You'll get the same amount of food output even with a smaller workforce. So encourage people to move out of agriculture, move into industry, and you will be subsidizing, accelerating the growth of the modern sector, and you won't be losing food output. The other approach is, no, there are ways in which you can raise the productivity of people both in agriculture or if they move to the non-farm sector. If we take any particular country, agricultural systems go through phases. In the United States, for example, in the early 1800s, there were two major farm labor systems. And remember, when we talk about farm labor, the main issue is always going to wind up being seasonal farm labor. How do you get people to be on standby and be available for jobs that will last anywhere from several weeks to 6 or 8 months? So the three major systems in a country like the United States were large families who produced what they needed to live on. There was no real reason to produce a surplus because transport costs were too high to take it to the few cities that there were. And then, of course, in the southeastern states, slaves, because the season was 8 months long. Therefore, farmers could justify providing upkeep for a whole year because of the huge peak seasonal need for cotton. And cotton, of course, was a non-perishable commodity that could be baled up and sent to Europe. But it was really in the Western United States that developed the farm labor systems, which are now becoming more dominant in rich countries in many parts of the world. The basic story is pretty simple. Under the Spanish and then the Mexican governments, there were large grants of land to favored people. And those large land grants were preserved when the Western states became part of the United States. And the theory was they would have to be broken up once transport costs were lowered and you could produce Mediterranean crops and ship them by the railroad to the East Coast where most Americans lived. But what happened was that Chinese were imported to build a railroad through the mountains. And when the railroad was completed, there was a recession in California. After all, the industry that had built up was now not productive, since you could bring cheap things from bigger factories in the Midwest. And so the Chinese became the scapegoats for the recession that followed the railroad. They were driven out of cities. They became migrant workers. And the notion at the time was they come with the wind, go with the dust. The farmer is not responsible for them in the off season. They're paid when they're needed, and then they go away. And so the story really was waves of migrants who preserved as it were, almost an accidental system of large farms. The Chinese were excluded, so then Japanese came, they were excluded, then South Asians. And there was one period in the United States Western farm labor history in which the majority of seasonal workers were white US citizens, and that was the 1930s. There had been an expansion into areas that typically weren't farmed, a big dust bowl, people were driven out, and they went to California, and we got a lot of literature and movies about the treatment of one group of Americans by another during the 1930s. But since the 1940s, it's been primarily Mexican-born workers who are employed on the large farms in the Western United States. So with that little history, now let's look at seasonal farm workers in selected industrial countries around the world. So roughly speaking, in North America, we have 5 million hired farm workers. There's about 50,000 Mexican-born workers in Canada's seasonal workforce. There's about 2/3 of the 3 million seasonal workers in United States agriculture were born in Mexico, and there's about 3 million hired workers in Mexican agriculture. So it's they're roughly 5 million of the 6 million hired workers in North American agriculture are Mexican born. Canada has several programs for bringing in agricultural guest workers. The Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program is best known, bringing people from Mexico and as well as Caribbean islands like Jamaica to work seasonally in Canada. It's sometimes considered a model program because what it does is brings people in, lets them stay in Canada for up to about 8 months. They earn higher wages than they would earn at home, and they return back to their countries, and it has a relatively high return rate. But it's not the only program. There are other programs as well. Canada has been a country that's been willing to experiment with several different kinds of programs, including a program in which you arrive as a guest worker, often not in a seasonal job, but in a year-round food processing or meat packing job or in nurseries. And then you earn the right to get an immigrant visa and stay in the country longer. In the United States, we have a big agricultural sector. The United States is a major exporter of agricultural commodities. But when you really look at where workers are employed, they're employed in only 6 of the roughly 35 sectors into which agriculture is divided. And it's often a surprise to people to realize that what we call crop support is the #1 employer within the agricultural sector. So what is crop support? It's non-farm employers who bring workers to farms, typically labor contractors. So the largest single employer is not a farmer. It's a non-farm employer who brings people to farms. And after that comes what you would expect, the fruits and nuts and the greenhouses and dairy and vegetables. The important point is that increasingly, when you look at employment in agriculture, it's not a farmer hiring 2 or 3 workers. It's a farm labor contractor who has crews of 20 to 40 workers and takes them from one farm to another. That's what crop support means. And in California, since 2009, more workers have been brought to farms by non-farm employers than were hired directly by farmers. That's not true for the United States as a whole, but the old idea of the farmer having 1 or 2 hired hands is rapidly disappearing as we get these fewer and larger farms that depend heavily on hired workers. So we have the growth of a model of bringing workers to farms by non-farm employers, and we have an industry, this labor contracting industry, which has a very mixed reputation. There are some good labor contractors, there are many not so good labor contractors, and this is true both in a country like the United States, it's also true in Mexico, it's true in Canada, it's true in most countries that labor contractors have proven to be very difficult for governments to regulate effectively. And who are the workers? Well, in a country like the United States, the workers are aging, and this is true in most rich countries, that there is an aging workforce. What makes the United States a little different is that half of the workers are unauthorized. That is, they're not legally authorized to work in the United States, but most of those unauthorized workers actually have been in the US quite a while, and many of them have US-born children. So what happens is that if the children are educated in the United States, they typically do not follow their parents into the fields. So the system is one in which you bring in relatively low-skilled workers. They work for 10 or 20 years, but then their children don't replace them. But what does happen? Well, what happens is that trends that were already underway before COVID have now been speeded up. And the 3 main trends in US agriculture, and this will be true in other agricultural systems as well, is there's lots of new interest in labor-saving mechanization. Despite COVID, and there were more guest workers in 2020 rather than fewer. Despite the restaurants closing, we learned it was very hard to move unemployed restaurant workers into the fields, and we're importing more fruits and vegetables. It's already true that in human history, agricultural history, is replacing hand labor with machines. And that started a long time ago, and it's continuing. But the kinds of tasks that are still done by hand are those that are very, very hard to mechanize. But there's been a big resurgence of interest in saying, how can we rethink the whole process from farm to fork and think about how we're going to handle a particular commodity mechanically? And the big story here seems to be when you develop robots for military purposes, which a lot of work is ongoing, the whole concept is performance, not cost. Spend $10 million, save a soldier. But when you develop machines for agriculture, the main idea is cost, not performance. It doesn't matter if the machine misses 10 apples on the tree. The machine has to be cheap, it has to be durable, it has to work 24/7 and not break down. And that new interest in low-cost mechanization is something that is spreading rapidly. The second big change that occurred last year and is continuing this year is the rise of guest workers. So remember, when restaurants closed, the assumption was we would be moving people from one part of the food system back to farms. That didn't happen. Instead, we had a lot more guest workers coming in, and this year it's going up again. In the United States, they're called H-2A workers for the particular program, but it's one of the larger guest worker programs. Last year, roughly 275,000 jobs were filled with guest workers. There's an important point about agricultural guest workers that explains why their number is rising in a lot of places. They actually cost more money than US workers. But the industry talks about just-in-time guest workers versus just-in-case US workers. So if an H-2A worker is selected by the employer, remember, you're only picking one of 5 or 10 people who wants to enter and earn a higher wage, there tends to be positive recruitment networks. That is, you pick the best workers and they bring their friends and relatives into the crew. If you're looking at local workers, you tend to pick people who can't get better jobs, and you get a much more diverse workforce. If a local worker finds a better job, he or she may move off and take that job. So they say you hire extra local workers just in case they don't show up. The phrase that's used a lot in the industry is H-2A workers are reliable and loyal, they're willing to work extra hours, and that extra money or the extra cost involved winds up being, as it were, a form of labor insurance. So one could calculate exactly what's the value of labor insurance for producers of perishable commodities. The third big trend is more imports. I mean, a country like the United States, and I'm sure many European countries are similar, already imports half of its fresh fruit. We eat a lot of bananas and a lot of tropical fruit, and about a third of the vegetables. And since fruits and vegetables basically are water, almost all fruits and vegetables are over 90% water, Mexico, the transport costs are very important. And so Mexico is the source for the United States of half of the fresh fruit imports and 3/4 of the fresh vegetable imports. And the big 3 Mexican exports are tomatoes, avocados, and berries. And we have we have 1 million people. So remember, 3 million hired workers are employed in Mexican agriculture. 1 out of 3 hired workers in Mexican agriculture is actually working on farms that export to the United States. So this is a case of trade in place of migration, because what is happening is that the work is being done in Mexico and then the commodities are shipped rather than the workers coming across the border. In 1990, Mexican President Salinas said that the United States should endorse NAFTA because the US could take either Mexican tomatoes or tomato pickers. It turns out to be true that tomatoes are picked by Mexican-born workers in the United States and in Canada and in Mexico. But Mexico is the world's largest exporter of tomatoes. Mexico supplies well over half of the fresh tomatoes consumed in the United States. And so we always talk about trade in place of migration. Here is an example of which 1 million there are 1 million Mexican-born workers in Mexican export agriculture. There's about 2 million Mexican-born workers employed in U.S. agriculture. So it's not as if there's more in Mexico than the U.S., but it's rising rather than falling. There's a hard question about how do you think about those jobs in Mexican export agriculture? Are they analogous to the factories in Southeast Asia that were the bridge to higher tech jobs? It's important to remember that the export agriculture in Mexico provides relatively good jobs for people with relatively little education. We did a survey, the average age is 32, level of education is about 7 years, people earning 2 or 3 times the minimum wage. One of the things that's important is guest workers are almost always young men, but in export agriculture, it's almost half women. So just quickly, since we're running out of time, it's a similar story. It's similar but different in many other countries. Many other countries, rich countries, rely on local workers who are often seeking better jobs, as well as migrants from poorer countries for whom seasonal work is a way to earn much higher wages than they could at home. We know that in Southern European countries where commodities are similar to the Mediterranean styles in California, there's lots of workers coming in from both Eastern Europe and from Africa. In Australia and New Zealand, Australia produces primarily for its own consumption. That is, it's not an export kind of country like some others. And what it relies heavily on are backpackers, who are young people who come to Australia, pay their own way, pay for their own housing. And if they do 88 days of farm work in the first year, they get to stay a second year and work in any kind of job. And as you may have read, Australia is struggling with their harvest this year because the borders are closed and backpackers can't get in. New Zealand, by contrast, is a major exporter of fruits and vegetables, and it relies more on adults from the Pacific Islands. For those workers, the employer's got to pay part of the cost of transportation and housing, but the justification is it's a bigger export sector. It's not just rich countries. They're also middle-income developing countries such as Brazil. Remember, Brazil is the largest ag exporter among middle-income developing countries, and it relies largely on migration from south to north, or north to south. Most of the poor people are in north, most of the agriculture is in the south, but a lot of the agriculture that employed hundreds of thousands of migrants is being mechanized. So now we come to what do you do about this? And then I'll stop. We know that the ILO has its conventions and the 2 on migrant workers specifically. The core principle is equal treatment in the workplace. And that's both the right thing to do and the best way to protect local workers from unfair competition. We also know that when there are issues, the ILO tends to take a mend, not end policy to improve labor conditions. I mean, what happens when you do find bad labor conditions in agriculture? If you do a boycott, you may eliminate the exploitation, but you also eliminate all the jobs that people often depend on. So how do you think about taking a mend approach, that is, fix the bad things, and without necessarily destroying the jobs, which do provide incomes for people? We just did a big study, the first big study of enforcing labor laws in agriculture. And in the United States, we only actually inspect about 100 farms a month, and about 70% of them have violations. The main sort of takeaway is there will never be enough inspectors to have effective enforcement in agriculture. You can think about unions, and unions can be very important, but the main issue that they have in all countries is that the most capable workers are the first to leave. And so you have to constantly be organizing new workers, because the farm labor market is a flow-through labor market. People come in, people stay a while, and then leave. And of course, there's lots of fair trade type NGOs. They develop protocols, they persuade buyers to endorse them, farmers enroll in order to sell their commodities. In some ways, it's been a top-down approach because you persuade the buyer to say, I won't buy from you unless you have a certificate from a particular NGO that certified you. The footprint is growing, but it's relatively small. I said at the outset, and this is sort of my final thing, is when we're looking for how to think about, amend rather than end approach to improving farm worker compliance with farm labor laws is what's a model that may work? And one model that may work is the food safety model. Because remember, we're talking about commodities that are typically not cooked, and therefore they do have the potential to make people sick or die. And we had some cases of that. What that led to was the generation of an enormous amount of data. An audit or an investigation is a snapshot. It's how are things today? What you really want is a motion picture. You want to know that there was compliance with a law or compliance with a food safety protocol day after day after day. In food safety, this idea of measuring things and generating data created a whole ecosystem of private firms that came in and developed algorithms to spot dangers. And then, of course, with the traceback systems, you go back to the field, to the crew where the problem emerged. I don't know if that will, in the end, I mean, whether big data, of course, is not going to necessarily solve issues, but one of the things that we really need is some way to rethink about how to protect this ever more vulnerable workforce as employment in agriculture continues to shrink and as the workforce continues to be local workers who don't have other job options and migrants with limited rights. In the book, there's a look at labor law enforcement and unions and fair trade. They're all good. They're necessary. They're probably not sufficient. But the question is, how really can you use sort of private sector efforts to supplement the efforts of unions, governments, NGOs, et cetera, to bring about something like more continuous or motion picture compliance? So that's my presentation on this. I look forward to the comments and to the discussion. And I will now stop sharing so that we can see the other people. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Phil, for this great overview of the issues and your book. Before we go to our first discussant, I would just like to remind everybody who's watching and listening that if you want to ask a question, please type it into the chat box of YouTube and we will get to your question after the two discussants have had a chance to speak. So with that, I will turn to our first discussant, who I think is Christiane.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, Phil, congratulations on your new book. And also thank you very much for another inspiring and interesting talk, plenty of innovative ideas. And thanks also very much, Martin and the organizers, for having us here today and giving us the opportunity for some comments. I would like to react to Phil's presentation with comments at 3 levels. First, equal treatment of migrant workers from an ILO perspective. Second, what the concept of essential workers developed last year during the COVID-19 pandemic might imply for agricultural workers, in particular migrant workers in agriculture. And third, Phil's push for employers generating data that is analyzed for labor law enforcement and by buyers. And I will end with a few thoughts and questionings about the future. On the equal treatment side, you may have seen in one of Phil's slides that there are indeed 2 migrant-specific ILO conventions of 1949 and of 1975, and both underline the principle of equal treatment for migrant workers. In fact, the ILO does consider that the best way to protect migrant workers is treating them the same way as local workers, which then also protects locals against unfair competition from migrants. And Phil has already made that point. But there is a little bit of a problem with the equal treatment principle because it tends not to deliver anymore for the migrants when certain jobs become migrant jobs. And there is no more comparison possible with local workers. Indeed, as Phil has explained to us here today, and also he does in his book, many hired farm workers today are migrants. And he has also shown very pointedly how vulnerable farm workers are in general, and this is worldwide. So the question then arises, did the migrantization of the sector bring down the working conditions, or were working conditions so bad that migrants were the only workers to accept these jobs for lack of alternatives? I suppose that there is probably a bit of both, depending on what country and region one looks at, and the two phenomena might also reinforce each other. By the way, when I say migrantization, I mean the setting up of ever more seasonal foreign worker programs and migrant workers being tied to particular employers explicitly or de facto via the structure of the immigration regulations. Temporary foreign worker programs that have become a worldwide phenomenon usually rely on a variety of state-implemented obstacles to workers' ability to exit their employment relationship. And this is done by associating the act of quitting or losing one's jobs with risks of one or several state sanctions, such as nullifying the authorization of work or reside in the country. And this then makes the migrant workers very vulnerable to employers' exploitation. So it's state sanctions that have that effect. For progress to occur, it's probably not very important to resolve the hen and egg question of what came first, the bad working conditions or the migrants. But it is important to acknowledge the realities of agricultural work, as Phil does really brilliantly in his book. And this then brings me to my next point about the COVID-19 pandemic and agricultural workers. The COVID-19 pandemic clearly has put agriculture with its inherent risks and specific skill needs in the spotlight of international attention. And it has exposed the role of migrant workers in the agricultural sector and their important contribution to host economies and societies. Last year, with the closure of borders in response to COVID-19, a noticeable shortage of seasonal migrant workers in agriculture very quickly appeared, and government tended to react with three sets of policy measures. Number one, they tapped into the national workforce, which often did not work very well. In fact, farmers are quite often unhappy to rely on a workforce coming from the cities who have no prior experience or knowledge about the basics of harvesting or planting particular crops. And indeed, many asparagus farmers in Germany and Switzerland were very quick to complain about their new local farmhands who destroyed more than half of the harvest in some of the fields. Some of the farmers were also very skeptical about the fact whether city dwellers would show up at all and respond to the demand by governments, because agricultural work is known to be tough and tiring. Admittedly, in a country such as France, very quickly, within a few days, more than 150,000 volunteers showed up. But probably this can be explained by the extremely strict confinement conditions in the country. People just wanted to leave their apartment, and many were reported to have left the fields after 2 or 3 days of work therein. So these measures tapping into the national workforce didn't work very well. A second set of measures that governments came up with were exceptions in travel bans, as well as extensions to visas and work permits. And here one can cite the example of Italy that created a so-called green corridor with Romania. Or another example, Germany flew in some 80,000 agricultural workers from Eastern European countries in planes hired by the government between the month of April and May 2020. So 80,000 workers in government planes in only 2 months. Third issue, the governments, and here one can cite Spain and Italy, developed regularization plans for people in irregular situations. And some governments also resorted to asylum seekers, even despite the fact that in most countries of the world, the status usually does not normally allow people to work. So if you're interested in any details, I'm very happy to share with you an ILO brief that my colleague Fabiola Mieres, who will speak after me, and I have written, where we analyze these policies in more detail. And where we also suggest that the pandemic may present an opportunity for the redesign of seasonal foreign worker schemes. And we offer some ideas on the fundamental principles that should be observed in such a redesign. We also note that agricultural work, along with health and care work and certain functions in retailing and transport, have been labeled essential work last year. And this new label of essential work suggests a social valorization of agricultural work. So chances are that the new recognition given to agricultural work also leads to improvements that manifest in decent work and valorization of agricultural work, perhaps also as a profession. And migrant workers are a fundamental part of this sector. So Fabiola and I argue that if and where improvements occur, migrant workers must be able to benefit from pay rises and any other betterments on an equal footing with local workers. And seasonal worker programs must be integrated in any plans for improvement. It must not be designed as sort of a parallel reality. Agriculture is highly subsidized in many rich countries, and Phil also make that point. And we believe that subsidies could be restructured to reward better working conditions for farm workers instead of output only. And in Europe, indeed, there are first debates about this. Last month, some 300 European organizations called for the inclusion of provisions on workers' rights in the reform of the EU's common agricultural policy. In an open letter, these organizations argued that any direct payments should be made conditional on respect for the application of working conditions and employment conditions under relevant collective agreements, national and EU law, and ILO conventions as well. And in this context, I believe that Phil's suggestions about monitoring working conditions could come in quite handy, because you want to know what the working conditions are if you want to reward them. But I would like to pronounce a few words of caution in this context. Whatever one suggests in this area, it must not introduce further power imbalances between employers and workers. This data collection must not become an instrument of worker control, as with certain retailers and distributors, where every step of the employee is monitored. And officially, this is done to be helping the worker to become more efficient. But in reality, it's often to reprimand and sanction the workers. So Phil's idea that workers could be encouraged to keep and upload from phone-based apps records of hours and wages to cross-check employer-provided data is therefore, I would say, more than welcome. Perhaps one must even go one step further and make this move and not only an encouragement, but this would sort of become the other side of the coin of data collection by employers. Phil's idea of creating possibilities for employer peer control is also a very good one, I find. And this made me think of Scandinavian countries where the industrial relations systems are particularly strong, and both workers and employers very much value that industrial relation system and its continuing existence. And in these countries, the numbers of irregular migrant workers are also particularly low. And so I suppose this can be attributed to the fact that not only the trade unions fear unfair competition via people in irregular situations, but the employers also check on their peers to play by the rules. And my final remarks are really questions about the future and inspired by what Phil said about mechanization and automation via artificial intelligence on the one hand, and also about rich consumers on the other. And with me being European, they come from a quite European perspective. I wonder whether we are moving towards a two-class agriculture in rich countries. Might we witness a future where mass and basic food production is done with machines, and a range of more expensive fruits and vegetables continues to be produced by human beings, but under better conditions? I think in particular of the move towards organic food production in Europe, which is often characterized by smaller production units. It's done on small farms very often. And rich consumers should be able to pay more, including also for better working conditions. For them, paying more would not be a life changer, but for the agricultural worker, whether they are local or farm or migrant workers, yes, it is a life changer to receive more pay and to work under better conditions. And one could take as a sort of analogy the health sector, where people also have basic health insurance in many countries, and if they wish, they can take out complementary health insurance for free choice of doctor, alternative medicine, or whatever, but they have to pay more. And surely this idea of this two-class agriculture is not a world of equality, but at least it would not be a world where prime products are delivered cheaply to rich consumers on the back of very vulnerable agricultural workers. And with that thought, I pass it on to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Christiana, for this excellent comments. And we'll go straight to Fabiola. And I'll remind everybody, if you have questions, please post them in the chat box on YouTube. I already see a few questions, but if others want to add questions, you can do so anytime. Fabiola.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Phil, for providing the opportunity to engage with your book. Also, thank you for the MPC for having us and reflecting on these very important issues that we deal with every day of our working lives and lives. Before I move on to my specific comments, I would like to say that I highly recommend reading the book. It has so many different angles that are very difficult to address in just 8 minutes, but I will do my best. So the prosperity paradox asks, why do farm workers become more vulnerable as countries get richer? Over the course of nicely structured 7 chapters, Phil Martin guides us through rich historical and contemporary evidence that traces the incorporation of farm workers in the sector that feed us. An incisive narrative with clear and political relevance, the contributions in this book will keep us talking for years to come and of course inform future research. Starting with a global snapshot that describes the consolidation of farm production on larger farms that rely on high labor, it moves on to unpack perspectives on urban-rural migration rooted in economics, which reminds us of the importance of structural transformation in understanding contemporary forms of migrant workers' inclusion. In an extremely engaging tone, maybe this discussion could be enriched by also considering traditions from labor market segmentation, as the incorporation of farm workers has also been guided and sustained by other aspects, such as race, ethnicity, and gender, which are key in the social construction of labor markets. Chapter 4 immerses us into the evolution of farm labor in the United States, and help us understand the crafting of agricultural exceptionalism embedded in values around the family farm that justified exclusions from labor legislation in the mid-30s, which we can rightly question today, since the share of migrant hired farm workers rises, especially in developed economies, as the book compellingly shows. Is it still permissible to justify exclusions in labor law? This opens a set of moral questions that the book does not intend to address, but as it evolves, it does provide pragmatic solutions to entrenched vulnerabilities that have been historically assembled and affect farm workers' populations. Professor Martin analyzes as well experiences in Canada, Britain, mostly pre-Brexit, Italy, Spain, Australia, New Zealand, and Brazil. Considering historical and contextual specificities, these cases share common grounds in the sources of vulnerability along 2 interrelated fields: the production of migration regimes based mostly on temporary forms, particularly in industrialized countries, on one hand, and the configuration of global supply chain dynamics on the other, high levels of concentration in retailing that dictate farm production, creating price squeezes, common challenges in formalizing workers, and addressing irregularity among other complexities. These processes have been accompanied by the consolidation of the business of labor intermediation around the figure of the farm labor contractor and other intermediaries, as Professor Martin recently pointed out to us. In Chapter 6, the existing legal framework for protection at the global level is described, in particular ILO conventions for the protection of migrant workers and other related ILO agriculture conventions. The chapter also traces the competing interests of key actors in the governance of migration, namely governments, trade unions, eventually NGOs, and employers. But most importantly, it really highlights the power dynamics among these and exposes us to difficult policy choices. For instance, and I quote, "When governments face a choice between supporting farm exporters or farm workers, they often favor exporters because of the jobs that they provide and the foreign currency they earn." The challenges faced by trade unions are addressed in many parts of the book. Legal obstacles to unionization, lack of union leadership, and historical structure issues around representation are very well addressed. After documenting the complex policy and political economic changes in various countries responsible for producing migrant farm worker vulnerability, Martin dedicates Chapter 7, his final chapter, to proposals that can be considered innovative solutions based on food security mechanisms. Different certification schemes from Fair Trade USA to the Equitable Food Initiative and others are recounted, including the Fair Food Program run by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. These schemes and initiatives differ in their origins and logics. While some are industry-led, the Fair Food Program stands out, in my view, as a primary example of a multi-party bargaining case based on worker-driven social responsibility. Here in a forthcoming paper for an ILR special issue to be published next year with my colleague Siobhan McGrath from Durham University, we show that the Fair Food Program provides a corrective alternative to workers' voice to farm workers in the US. Even though they are accorded basic constitutional protection for freedom of association, they are excluded from the scope of the National Labor Relations Act for organizing a trade union or engaging in collective bargaining. A combination of 5 key interrelated elements stand out in this program: worker-informed standards, worker education within an integrated approach to the supply chain, a thorough complaint resolution system, independent monitoring, and market consequences for non-compliance with legally binding agreements. All these elements characterize the Fair Food Program and differentiate it in its capacity to alter power structures in the tomato supply chain and eventually other crops, as the program is expanding across crops and states in the US. So temporary schemes influence labor intermediation and recruitment channels. Under design, they limit prospects for workers' voice and representation. In cases where workers can join trade unions on paper, enforcement is low due to the fear of deportation, the deportability effect, as Leah Bosco rightly showed us for the case of Canada. Therefore, under well-established programs such as the Fair Food Program, the progressive inclusion of H2A workers could represent a potential to mitigate and even eradicate abusive recruitment practices that have been historically embedded in the agriculture sector, while linking this to the provision of decent working conditions once the job and the workers are on the job. In this vein, a closer look at food security mechanisms allow us to inquire: in what ways can food security protocols diffuse structural change when mounting evidence showed that social auditing and traceability do not deliver when it comes to labor rights? What does compliance with labor law mean when in some national contexts, this is restricted to fundamental enabling rights such as freedom of association and collective bargaining? The ILO calls these enabling rights as rights that allow the achievement of other rights, also known as process rights. It might seem that the meaning of compliance, as stemming from the private codes, is also constructed, and in so doing, the meaning of national law is built as a signifier. However, the powerful data collection exercise involved in following food security paradigms might help us to better elucidate gender dynamics that are difficult to tease out with traditional survey and other methods. This new data might provide us with the opportunity to better include social reproduction aspects that sustain the sector. This area, I believe, deserves further exploration. Let us imagine that the food security paradigm helps us address some of the labor abuses, but how can it resolve the vulnerability that stem from immigration law? What does this tell us about the intersection of migration law and labor law? The Prosperity Paradox is an excellent read for anyone interested in the complex mix of development, farm labor, migration, and the challenges of protection that stem from both public and private forms of regulation. It spurs thinking and opens areas of further exploration by bringing us back to an old problem with new light. It also reminds us that as policymakers and scholars, we still have a lot of work to do. We have not yet resolved the farm labor issue. Towards the future, this book also plants seeds for rethinking the role of immigration policy in sectoral approaches amid current debates on the future of work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fabiola, for these great comments. Phil, a lot to think about and respond to, but also in the interest of time, we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I suggest that I first raise some of the questions that some of our viewers posted in the chat box, and maybe then you can return to some of the issues that have been raised by Christiana and Fabiola. Obviously, one big picture question is the relationship between immigration and immigration policy on the one hand and agriculture as such. I think both Christiana and Fabiola raised those issues. Okay, so we've got two questions from Pavel Kaczmarczyk. One, he's asking you if you could elaborate a little bit on the patterns of modernization in US agriculture across different types of production, different types of farms. Has what you described, is it a general trend, or are there differences across different types of production and farm size and so on? And Pavel also asks, based on the US case, under what conditions you can expect trade to replace migration, if you could say a little bit more about that. I've got two questions from Roxana Babulescu. The first one relates to your point about fresh produce. And she's asking, if you think about countries in the global north and that they have a small summer season, limited crops, people often have global diets, are fresh produce imports at very high rates, say 90%. Is that the solution? I think you began to talk about that, but is that in a way the solution to the issues? And her second question relates to seasonal agricultural worker programs. She comments that there's quite some variation across countries and limited appetite for international conventions. What's your view on the role of kind of global governance and international conventions in these seasonal worker programs? So maybe you could take those two sets of questions first, and then we return to some of Fabiola and Christiana's comments, and I'll take some other questions from the audience as well. Phil.
Okay, thank you to the commentators and for the questions. Let me start with the second one first. And one of the points that Christiane made, and I think it's very important, is that sometimes the answers to farm level problems happen in the marketing system or in the supermarkets, not on the farm. So we already have, of course, a system of organic and conventional produce in most supermarkets. We could well have in the future hand harvested and machine harvested, as Christiane was pointing out. This, by the same token, you know, the question, Roxana makes a point about local agriculture and global diets. I mean, that has been what has happened. Remember, the share of income that gets spent on food goes down as incomes go up, as countries get richer. And despite everything that we know we should do in eating, if you actually look at the data, what we say we eat and what we actually eat are two different things. It's kind of like drinking and many other things as well. In most rich countries, there's been a huge increase in the consumption of butter and cheese and other items which are good, but maybe not necessarily good, too much for one. In developing countries, there's a huge increase in meat consumption. So what has been happening is that it's higher income people who are living locally but eating globally. It's partly due to immigration to rich countries, changing preferences, but a lot of it is the willingness or the desire of young people to experiment with different taste and different commodities. And that is likely to increase, that is, the share of imports in rich country diets is likely to increase because the supply system is getting ever better. I mean, if you want to see the future of agriculture, go to northern Peru, where there has been a huge expansion in the production of blueberries and avocados and a whole lot of other things. And what you really see there, I mean, and apart from, depending on your point of view, the way in which governments can favor particular investors by moving water and putting in infrastructure, but what you see is that agriculture is a very capital intensive industry. So it's a lot of foreign investors and pension funds moving in to develop a sector which will produce commodities, not for local people, but for export. And so this idea, remember, much of what we're talking about is producing fresh produce for relatively high income consumers. On seasonal workers, I mean, it would be an interesting exercise if we could do it, to look at the variety of seasonal worker programs. I mean, and all the new ideas that are out there, but haven't, are not really being tried. So one of the big things that's talked about, but really hasn't been tried very much, is visa portability. So you come in, you're confined to a sector, and you protect yourself because you can move from one to another. Part of the problem with that, of course, is that guest worker programs have normally been put in place because of labor shortages. And so you measure the shortage on the basis of a job that can't be filled by a local worker. How do you change the concept and say, well, we're going to just let workers float? And the problem, of course, with that is who's responsible for the worker? I mean, who's responsible when there's not unemployment? Are we going to let the floating guest workers be eligible for unemployment? What about housing? I mean, who is responsible for a person when there's floating? There's a lot of other ones about basically do a period of indenture and then you can earn an immigrant visa. We already have that in care programs in Canada stuff. Is that the way out? I don't know. There's a lot of ideas. Most of them haven't been tried. Just quickly, lots on patterns of modernization and trade. I think trade in fruits and vegetables is likely to go up. The big issue is that just as all governments intervene in agriculture, agricultural trade, of course, was the downfall of the Doha round when the developing countries led by India could not agree with the industrial countries want to keep on protecting their agricultural systems. The developing countries that have a comparative advantage can't really get much breakthrough, but there will be, I think, more trade in fresh produce because there have been a lot of technical changes in the production of particular commodities. And there's almost a newcomer advantage. So in other words, when I go to a tomato farm in Mexico, it looks a lot like a factory. It's a greenhouse or a plastic covered hoop structure. Where you go to a tomato farm in the US, it's old. Everything is old because they know 61% of US tomatoes last year were imported from Mexico. And so who's going to put investment into a declining sector in industrial countries? Raisins, Turkey can produce them much cheaper than the United States. Who's going to invest in mechanized systems for producing raisins because it's a declining industry in the United States? It would be like saying, let's put a whole lot of money into garment manufacturing in a rich country when it's by and large already been moved to other countries. So the trade to replace migration is growing, but there's also going to be an awful lot of debates about, we need to block the imports of those blueberries because we need food security, we need food safety. And then patterns of modernization. This is one where one could do a whole book. But remember, when we think about essential workers doing essential jobs in agriculture, most people forget that the number one employer of H-2A workers in the United States is to grow tobacco. So sure, agri-food is essential, but will we start asking questions like exactly what is essential in a pandemic? Is tobacco essential? It is, maybe for some people. What about berries, fresh berries to have with cream? I mean, can you get by a year without them if there's a pandemic, et cetera? So when we get to that issue about what's essential and how we should do, One of the ironies, Apple's is the largest single employer of hired workers in the United States. In the old days, there were red apples and yellow apples. And actually, they figured out ways to harvest them mechanically. But in today's world, you have different varieties of apples. They're very expensive and they're fragile, and therefore they're picked by hand. Honeycrisp, Cosmic Crisp, all these kinds of things. So on the one hand, we've had technological developments, but on the other hand, consumers have moved their preferences toward things which are more difficult to mechanize. How we square that, I don't know. There's a publication coming out which looks at this commodity by commodity. And as you go across the list of commodities, you see that on the one hand, there are technological developments that would make it easier to do things with machines, but then there's consumer preferences which work against that. It's exactly what Christian was saying. Our desires are moving toward things which are more difficult to mechanize rather than less. Let me stop so we get a chance for a few more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I've got two, before we can return to the larger issues raised by Christiane and Fabiola, two more questions from the chat. One you've begun to address already, but maybe we should return to it briefly. Leanne Pereira asks whether you could speak further to your perspective on affording more mobility rights for migrant farm workers in rich countries under relevant immigration framework. So again, this idea that you give some mobility to migrant farm workers. And Ganyu Asis asks whether there can be a synergy between origin countries and destination countries in the protection of migrant farm workers. How do you see that dynamic? Is there a synergy, or are there opposing interests?
Okay, two very good questions. I guess I've always been a bit skeptical of visa portability as the answer to protecting workers. After all, many countries have local workers who are free to change jobs, and that doesn't necessarily protect them from workplace problems. It's clear that there's a trade-off. Visa portability means that if I'm assigned to a bad employer, I can move to another employer. The question will become, if I need, usually you need a first job to get into the country. And if and the Korean employment permit system has this, very few workers change employers. If you do change, you can easily get on a blacklist and you will not be returning. I mean, this is, you can say, okay, that's unfair. We have to have a way to deal with blacklists, but that turns out to be something that's very, very difficult to do. I know that many NGOs say the answer to protection is visa portability. I already mentioned this idea that, but we're filling a job that can't be filled with local workers. How do we square the whole labor shortage concept and the whole labor certification process with visa portability? Because what's going to happen is, if we have visa portability, the workers will gravitate to the higher wage jobs and the better working conditions, and you're still going to have the labor shortages sitting out there that have to be dealt with. The second thing is the cooperation between sending and receiving countries. There's already efforts. Many governments have labor attaches in receiving countries to whom workers can complain. I would say that it's kind of like unions. It's necessary, but there's many gaps between the theory and the reality, because a labor attaché is thinking of something different, perhaps, than the individual worker and his or her complaint. The labor attaché's job is to preserve and enlarge the number of opportunities to work at high wages. And there's a tendency of labor attachés, unless something is really serious, to take the employer side rather than the worker side, because they want ever more jobs for their workers. The other thing that, having dealt with quite a few labor attachés over the years, it's probably important to remember that a labor attaché is typically college educated and has never done the work, whereas the worker typically has a primary school education and is doing the work. There's a huge class difference between labor attachés abroad to serve workers and the workers who are actually there. That doesn't mean it can't work out, but there have been many cases in which the people from your own government who should have been looking out for you, workers felt frustrated that they weren't.
Thanks, Phil. I do want to bring in Christiana and Fabiola as well at the end in one last round. So Christiana, please go ahead.
Yes, just one word in relation to this. Okay, we cannot really have portability and people cannot change the employer because indeed the system is such that we will then have shortages again. I have really problems about that idea because we then should go one step further and say, but why do we have labor shortages in this particular sector? And that's precisely because the conditions are so bad. And can we not use artificial intelligence or mechanization to help increase the reputation of this sector and to help the workers who work in this sector, sort of make robots the assistants of workers? In sort of combine the idea of mechanics and human labor, and therefore improve the conditions, and sort of work on the salaries as well. I mean, and there are so many different ways of sort of deciding on how workers are being paid in that particular sector, and very often it's very stressful because it's hourly for so and so much product and so forth. So I think this is one way of changing and simply making the consumer pay a bit more, because we cannot simply accept that the immigration system serves this agricultural system, which has a lot of weaknesses, and where the agricultural system is not able to find the workers anymore. So this is indicative of, wow, we have a problem in this particular sector.
Thank you. Phil, before you kind of come back to that issue, Fabiola, is there anything you would like to add at this stage before we go back for final comments by Phil?
I think just very briefly, what I like in the discussion is that we really have to think of the structural conditions that we're creating for worker empowerment, and whether we're going to move aside from traditional mechanisms, collective bargaining, and what the new forms of governance can show us or not. What are the gaps there? I think we need to think harder about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Phil, we started a bit late, so I'm going to overrun by a few minutes. But if you could kind of wrap up reasonably briefly, and maybe do come back to this one issue, as I said before, I think that has been there in a number of questions, which is the relationship between, I suppose, immigration policy and agriculture policy. I mean, to what extent is what we're seeing in agriculture a result of particular types of immigration policies? And could we have a different type of agricultural system with different types of immigration policies? Okay,
well, first I want to thank everybody who's participated, and especially Martin and Fabiola and Christian. But let me just say, I mean, the main theme is I often hear people who have tried to deal with farm labor for a long time, basically saying, well, we haven't figured it out, but the good news is they're disappearing. There are fewer than them. So I wrote this to remind people the problem doesn't go away. Sure, it might get less visible as people become guest workers or become more invisible, but the problem does not disappear. So that's kind of the main takeaway, is that workers do become more vulnerable as the share of employment in agriculture shrinks. It is time for new thinking. And I don't know exactly where the answer lies. The idea, I mean, when we look around at where governments intervene in particular sectors and what the results are, I mean, agriculture is a sector in which all governments intervene. And when the government intervention first produces one contradiction, You subsidize the wine sector, all of a sudden you get too much wine, then you've got to distill the surplus. I mean, we can go through the dairy sector, we can go through all these sectors. Government intervention in one way produces something that requires a government intervention in the other way. So it's not like it's a straight line, it's often zigging back and forth. We are moving agricultural policy gradually from rewarding people by how much they produce to instead giving people, a guaranteed, as it were, income if they're employed in the sector. And we're starting to introduce climate policies, climate protection parts to it. Will we get to conditioning labor conditions on getting subsidies? It may work more in Europe, but in the United States, the agricultural subsidies are for mechanized crops, cotton and corn and wheat and soybeans, things like that, not for fresh produce. In Europe, there are some subsidies for the fresh produce sector. So therefore, that has more possibility in Europe than in the United States. I mean, very few producers of lettuce get any kind of subsidies. I think the hardest single thing in thinking about migration, labor, and the future of agriculture is the flexibility in the system is on the demand side of the labor market, not the supply side. So I always say there is a wage at which Americans would do farm work, and Germans would do farm work, and British people would do it. And let's say it's $100 an hour or $200 an hour. So there is a wage at which you would have a national workforce. But well before you get there, the farm jobs would disappear. Because they would disappear because of mechanization, they would disappear because of trade, they would disappear because the price of raspberries got to be $20 for 100 grams, and people, instead of raspberries, got strawberries or something. So, I mean, the hardest thing to deal with is, this is a sector, remember, the first census in the United States, and it's true everywhere else, the first census 200 years ago had 95% of the people in agriculture. Now it's 1.5%. So it's a sector in which there's a whole history of food production going up, but fewer people being employed in the sector. And when we want to improve conditions for workers, we always have to keep that negatively sloped demand curve in mind, because as we improve conditions, we also create incentives, either for labor-saving machines or for trade. And that's the big question, is how do we manage this in a way? Because we're seeing a higher share of guest workers in almost all agricultural systems. How do we manage this in a way that we don't just go back to the old way of thinking of farm labor reformers, which is, well, we can't help them so much in agriculture, but once they get out of agriculture, then they'll be covered by all the labor laws and stuff. Now that we're getting a more guest worker dependent agricultural sector in many countries, we really do have to confront this conjunction of a traditional farm labor problem with a new, ever more dependent guest worker policy. So there's a lot of questions there. There will be people after me, I'm sure, who work on these things, but thinking about how to develop a labor policy in a sector that's still going to employ workers in 2030, 2040, and 2050, but those workers are likely to be a higher share of people who are with some limited status from abroad. That's a big challenge that I hope many people will wind up working on.
Thank you. I think this brings us to the end of this webinar. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Philip for a fantastic presentation and a really good discussion. I'd like to encourage everybody to check out his book with Oxford University Press. I'd also like to thank Christiane and Fabiola for taking the time to be with us and for the great comments. I'd like to encourage everybody to check out the work of the ILO, in particular the migration branch on many of these issues. And finally, if you want to join us again in the coming weeks, next week we'll be talking about the regulation of emigration and immigration. And on the 24th of March, we will discuss a new book by P.O. Hansen called A Modern Migration Theory. So if you're free, please join us again. But for now, thanks again to the presenter and discussant, and thank you for joining us today.